This chapter is the first one for exam 3, and we're going to get into description of animals that live in the environment. So for the first part of this class, we talked about the earth, how it was formed and the geological processes. The second part was the ocean, the water, features and qualities of the water. And now we're going to get into the animals. We're going to introduce a mix of chemistry and biology because a lot of biology depends on chemistry, which quite honestly depends on geology. So we'll start with the terms for chapter 13. The first one is active transport. Active transport is any time something is moved, typically small molecules, that require energy. So when we talk about cells and metabolism, a lot of it is active transport. You have to use energy to move molecules. Adaptation is whenever plant and animal, bacteria, has evolved to have features that are unique to an environment. So for example, there's animals and plants that are adapted to the desert, right? They're able to deal with a lot of sunlight, not a lot of water. That's adaptation. Aphotic zone. An aphotic zone is the part of the ocean where photosynthesis does not occur. It's the opposite of the photic zone. The photic zone is usually the first, say 100 meters. So from the surface to about 100 meters depth, that's where you have enough light to have photosynthesis, which we'll talk about in a minute. The aphotic zone is below the photic zone. Not enough light occurs for photosynthesis. Artificial system of classification can be a variety of things, but what you need to know for this is it's how we kind of group things. So if you want to group animals based on having wings, you can do that. It's an artificial system, right? So just because they have wings doesn't mean they're related. Bats and birds are not each other's relative, right? Bats are mammals like us, and birds are birds, right? So a bat is a mammal, not a bird. So that's an artificial system of classification. An autotroph is something that makes its own energy. So a good example would be a plant photosynthesizing, right? Taking the energy from the sun and producing its own energy. So an autotroph. Biogeochemical cycle, describes a variety of different processes. A lot of times it's essentially the life of a compound. So what happens to carbon? Where does it go? What happens to nitrogen? Where does it go? And biogeochemical cycles are important for understanding what creates and what uses different elements, different compounds. Biogeochemical typically refers to carbon or nitrogen or phosphorus. Those are the big ones. Biological factor refers to any impact by biology, an organism. So if you want to say, this water is green because of algae, the algae is a biological factor. Carbon cycle is a type of biogeochemical cycle. It's one of the specific ones. The carbon cycle is really important because all life on Earth, as we know it, is carbon-based. So understanding how carbon moves throughout the Earth, how it's used, where it's stored, is really important. Chemosynthesis, we talked a lot about this in class with the deep sea tube worms. If you don't have enough sunlight for photosynthesis, one option to make energy and food is chemosynthesis. So you use chemicals essentially in place of the sunlight, right? In place of the energy. So that's chemosynthesis. Convergent evolution is when animals evolve to have similar shapes. And a good example, we just talked about this, is bats and birds. Both of them have wings, but they don't share a common ancestor. So a bat is more similar to me than it is to a bird. So convergent evolution is when characteristics evolve that look similar between different groups, but they don't share the same origin. So another good example of convergent evolution are eyes. Eyes are a good example. Eyes have evolved multiple times. Lots of examples of convergent evolution. Denitrifying bacteria. Denitrifying bacteria is a specific type of bacteria that is important in the nitrogen biogeochemical cycle. So it denitrifies, right? So it is important for explaining where a lot of nitrogen goes and where it comes from. Diffusion is whenever things, typically molecules or compounds, whenever things move down a gradient. So for example, if I'm sitting in this room and I have a candle that's producing smoke, right? As it's sitting here, that smoke is moving throughout the air. It's diffusing, it's moving throughout the air. Dysphotic zone, don't worry about that. Dissolved organic carbon. Dissolved organic carbon, also known as DOC, is essentially carbon that is not visible by the naked eye, but is in typically the water. So you can take a sample of water and measure how much carbon is in the water. You can't see it, but it's there, right? So that's called dissolved organic carbon. It's really important for a lot of bacteria because they're able to use that as an energy source. The next one is dissolved organic nitrogen, just like carbon, nitrogen, same reasons. Domain refers to kind of a classification group for animals and plants. So we'll come back when we talk about Linnaeus in a minute to domain. Ectothermic is something that a good example of ectothermic is a lizard. Lizards are not able to maintain their body temperatures, right? So if a lizard gets cold, it stays cold, right? And that's why you see lizards a lot of times when it's sunny, they'll go sit out on rocks to kind of warm up so they can, their bodies are capable of metabolism. If they get too cold, they just sit there. They can't move. They're not able to move. Endothermic is us, humans. We're able to maintain a constant body temperature, right? So your body temperature is usually 37-ish degrees C, right? Doesn't matter if it's 0 degrees outside or if it's 40 degrees outside. Your body temperature stays at 37 degrees C. Energy. Energy refers to, boy, this is a tough one. What is energy? Energy refers to, wow, what is energy? Refers to the ability to do work. So a lot of times when we talk about animals, we talk about energy, and the unit that we use is called ATP. And it's a molecule, ATP. It's made through photosynthesis. It's also used, remember we were talking about active transport? Active transport uses energy, ATP. Euphotic zone, don't worry about that. Evolution is when things change, organisms change over time. So for example, we talked about adaptation just a little while ago. Evolution is the gradual change of a species over time. So for example, you might have a species evolve, a bird, for example. A bird might evolve to have a longer feather or a shorter beak or, you know, a variety of different things. Food. Food is, what is food? Stuff you eat, right? So you eat food to get energy. At least for a human, that's what you do. And also maintain a constant body temperature. Food web is the relationships between different species in an ecosystem. So for example, you might have a whale that lives in the ocean that eats krill. That krill eats, you know, little plants, right? So the relationships, how the different species are connected, that's the food web. Heterotroph, we talked about autotroph, which makes its own food. A heterotroph cannot produce its own food. It has to consume food. So a cow is an example of a heterotroph. It can't produce its own energy, so it has to eat grass. Hierarchy refers to a very specific kind of organization. So if you think about like a business, like a hierarchy, you have the boss, you have the assistant, and you have, you know, other people. That's the hierarchy, right? So the boss typically is at the top, and then you have assistants, and it kind of moves down. Same thing happens in the ocean, right? You have a hierarchy, like, you know, we talked about food webs just recently. I'll show you an example of a pyramid, a food pyramid. I don't see it in the definitions, but we'll talk about a food pyramid in class. And it's essentially a hierarchy. Hydrostatic pressure is pressure that's caused by water. So for example, in cells, you have water in the cells, right? So if you ever look at a plant and a plant's kind of bending over because you haven't watered it recently, what's happened is it's lost a lot of its hydrostatic pressure, right? But if you water it, it'll stand, hopefully, you haven't killed it, it'll stand back up once it establishes that pressure. Hypertonic is water that has a lot of salt. Hyper, too much salt. Well, not too much, a lot of salt, as opposed to hypotonic, which is less salt. So you can imagine the situation if you have a cell, let me do this, a cell membrane here, you have a lot of salt, low salt, you have a gradient, right? So you can use that to do things, right? You can use a gradient to make energy, right? Variety of different things you can do with it. Isotonic, it's the same, iso, same. So it's this, the salt is the same on both sides. So there's no gradient in that case. Kingdom is, it's a classification term. So it refers to the fact, I believe it changes, unfortunately. I believe there's 5 kingdoms, it might be 6. I'm pretty sure it's 5. 5 kingdoms that of life as we know it on Earth. And they're very broad, and we'll talk about these in class. Limiting factor is a factor that controls a population. So for example, space could be one. You can't put more than 10 elephants in my office. It's a limiting factor. Space is a limiting factor. Food is also a limiting factor. Light, lots of different limiting factors. Controls the abundance of a species. Carl Linnaeus. Linnaeus was the first person to formally come up with the classification method. So when we talk about a species, humans, for example, our genus is Homo, H-O-M-O. Our genus is Sapiens, S-A-P-I-E-N-S, right? So the genus and species for a human being on Earth is Homo sapiens. So as a scientist, when we talk about Homo sapiens, we're talking about a very specific species. Now, if we talk about Homo as the genus, that includes things like Neanderthals, right? I can't remember the name, different species of Homo. There's Homo erectus, which is a different species. And these are all his ancestors of humans, but different species. So Linnaeus came up with the genus and species classification. So when we talk about different things, we can refer specifically to them instead of that green plant, because that green plant could be anything, right? There's lots of green plants out there. Or you could say the green plant with the yellow flower. Still lots of green plants with yellow flowers, right? So Linnaeus came up with a very specific way for scientists to understand the natural world. Mass extinction is whenever you have large numbers of species that go extinct. Typically, historically, this is a meteor, this is something catastrophic, right? It just essentially eliminates a lot of life. And I believe Earth has gone through 5 or 6 of them. It's been a lot. The KT boundary with the dinosaurs. A big meteor came, wiped out a lot of life. Metabolic rate is the rate that the metabolism of an organism works at. So for example, if you want to compare, let's say, a mouse and a sloth. A mouse has a very high metabolic rate. They're very active. They're always running around. They use a lot of energy. They eat a lot of food. A sloth, the ones that hang from the trees in Central America, don't move a lot. They don't use a lot of energy. They have a low metabolic rate. Right? Mutation. Mutation is a change in the DNA blueprint, genetic code of an organism. And these happen naturally, right? So mutations are a way for differences to eventually appear. And these are important because this is what allows evolution to happen. Right? So mutations are changes in DNA that are inherited. So, if you have a change in DNA, it goes to the next generation and it's passed on, it's inherited. Next definition is natural selection. Natural selection is the process whereby mutations lead to evolution. So natural selection is, imagine the situation where a bird has a mutation that allows it to have, say, a longer beak, right? Natural selection will favor that bird in the right environment. So if the right environment, this bird has a longer beak, it can get food better, then it will have more offspring. The population will evolve, and then they'll have longer beaks as compared to before. Right? So that's natural selection. Natural system of classification, that's essentially Linnaeus, right? That's kind of how we group things. And we try to base it on something that makes sense, right? We don't want to classify bats and birds together, right? Because you're mixing things up, right? You're mixing mammals and birds, right? If you want to understand how things evolve, you have to have a system that provides the correct classification. Nitrifying bacteria is similar to denitrifying, but they actually capture nitrogen from the atmosphere. So nitrifying bacteria are important because they're essentially, if you think about like the air around us has nitrogen in it, that nitrogen doesn't really do anything. But what nitrifying bacteria does is it takes that nitrogen and converts it into something usable. Think of it like fertilizer. That's essentially what they're doing. So nitrifying bacteria are really important in soil especially. Nitrogen cycle is a biogeochemical cycle, just has to do with nitrogen. Clearly involves nitrifying bacteria and denitrifying bacteria, as well as other things, but nitrogen cycle is a biogeochemical cycle. Nutrient is any element, compound, typically element, like iron or zinc that is needed for a process. So for example, what's a good nutrient? Nitrogen. Actually, not to mix things, let's say phosphorus. Phosphorus is also a nutrient. So plants need nitrogen and phosphorus. If you give a plant nitrogen but no phosphorus, it cannot grow well and it won't do well. It needs that nutrient. Osmosis is the process whereby things move down a gradient for water. So if we talk about osmosis, we were just talking about hypertonic, hypotonic, isotonic. That's concentration of salts. That's important because another way to look at that is the concentration of water, right? That's osmosis. So osmosis is the moving of water. Photic zone, talked about this before, the top part of the ocean where photosynthesis occurs. Photosynthesis, how do I describe photosynthesis in a definition? It's the ability of plants and some bacteria to use light energy from the sun to make essentially sugar. That's essentially what it is. So if you look at leaves and trees, they're essentially capturing the sunlight and making things out of it, right? Leaves, seeds, which are eaten by other things. Physical factor is, could be a variety of different things. But if you're at the beach, a physical factor might be, the amount of sunlight that the beach gets, right? The amount of, any physical attribute that exists that could impact a species. Primary consumer is something that consumes an autotroph. An easy way to think about this is an autotroph makes its own energy, right? So grass. So what eats grass? A cow or a bunny or rabbit. That's a primary consumer. Scientific name, we talked about this a little bit with Linnaeus. For humans, our genus and species is Homo sapien. That's our scientific name, Homo sapiens. Scientific name refers to the genus and the species. Genus is always capitalized, species always lowercase. It's either underlined or italics, one of the two. Species refers to an organism that cannot breed with another organism. So for example, if you compare a rabbit and a mouse, right? They're different species. They cannot reproduce to make offspring. A more specific example is if you have a desert mouse and a field mouse. They may be in the same genus, but they're different species, right? They're not able to mate and reproduce. Taxonomy is the science of classification of animals and plants and bacteria, right? So taxonomists study a specific group usually. So you might study crabs. And so you know a lot about crabs, you know how they're identified, how they're classified, how they're related. Top consumer is something that consumes a primary consumer. So we talked about how a cow is a primary consumer. It eats grass. So what eats a cow? Wolves, bears, humans, those are top consumers. And then finally, trophic pyramid. Trophic pyramid is kind of like the hierarchy we talked about, where you have the top consumer at the bottom, primary consumer, heterotroph, and it kind of looks like a pyramid. We'll talk about why it looks like a pyramid in class. So that does it for chapter 13.